Hello and welcome to the Coronavirus Survival Guide for Couples and Families, where we offer helpful information, recommendations, and suggestions for you and your loved ones on how to survive and thrive during this difficult time. This podcast is co-produced by the New York Center for Emotionally Focused Therapy. I'm Jeff Fine, couples and individual psychotherapist and certified in emotionally focused therapy. And emotionally focused therapy is a wonderful model that was developed to help people heal and build strong relationships with their loved ones and themselves. And we are here with Laura Price. Dr. Laura Price. Thank you so much for being here. Laura, I'm just going to introduce you quickly because you have such an impressive background, and we're going to tap into your expertise today to talk about the coronavirus, specifically for people with a history of trauma. And this is an area of expertise for you. So you, Laura, you're a licensed clinical psychologist in New York and Connecticut and co-founder of J&L Psychology Group. You're also a clinical assistant professor at the NYU School of Medicine and former telemental health coordinator for the Stephen A. Cohen Military Family Center at NYU Langone Health. And you've done extensive research and you have clinical experience in trauma and PSD, and that's really what we're going to tap into today with you. And you're also pursuing certification in emotionally focused therapy for couples, so you're busy.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jeff. I really appreciate this opportunity to meet with you and to talk to folks about what everyone's going through right now. It's a really difficult time.
Yeah, it really is a difficult time globally, individually, and couples and families for so many different reasons. But in this particular episode, we're going to kind of zero in on what it is like for people with a history of trauma, right? And how that is affecting them perhaps differently in some ways than people without a history of trauma. And because the coronavirus, just what's going on can be traumatic for everybody, but particularly so with people with trauma. So I think before we can even go forward, we need to talk about how we're defining trauma, so we can know what we're really talking about here. So what is trauma? And how can we begin to think about that and have a working definition as we go forward in this interview?
Sure. So if we think about trauma, we think about something that happens to us that essentially overwhelms your body, your mind, your capacity to function in the way that you usually do. And for human beings, we have sort of a threshold. And often when we think about a trauma, it's something that is, for example, it might be a natural disaster, or it might be physical violence, sexual violence, long-term child maltreatment or neglect, anything that is affecting the way that you're able to process emotions. It might have physical ramifications and also cognitive changes. And it just really just kind of floods the zone, so to speak. And if we were thinking about this in terms of what the COVID crisis has been, we're really thinking about it in terms of trauma that people are going through right now as a traumatic experience, because we're dealing with an unseen enemy, so to speak, a pathogen that has the capacity to kill and certainly to make you very ill. And so that in and of itself is an overwhelming thing for so many people, and it has disrupted your life. So even people who maybe have never experienced something, to this extent, can understand right now what it feels like to be disconcerted or having trouble functioning like you normally do. And so, as to your point, when we think about this, we're also thinking about what are the effects that might have this kind of trauma compound earlier traumas.
Right. So I think good point that people can be experiencing new trauma even if they don't have a history of trauma. But for our purposes here, somebody who, as you were saying in your kind of defining trauma, somebody who had kind of an overwhelming, flooded, emotionally threatening or physically threatening experience, whether it was ongoing or a one-time event, And then that, they carry that forward into this unprecedented time. So we're trying to think about those folks and how, if they're listening, what are some of the specific issues they might be dealing with, or how their family members might be alerted to some of the special circumstances for that person. And so what would people with a history of trauma be more likely to experience as a result of going through the pandemic right now?
So it's a great question. And I think that kind of being on the lookout for, right, some of these changes, and just either capacity to cope or behavior. And just to say outright too, just as a matter of how we cope with trauma, most people, find a way to make it through traumas and don't go on to develop what they call post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. That maybe a subset of people do go on and have more difficulty later on, but we're pretty resilient human beings. And so mostly we will kind of work our way through this, after the immediate threat is over. But thinking about those who might have more difficulty, and perhaps because they have PTSD or they've experienced a trauma in the past, they might find that this is a trigger for them. And that's really kind of the essence of how we react to trauma, is that something triggers something from the past. And so it may be, for example, being in close quarters. Someone who has had, let's say, significant sexual trauma might feel very trapped and might feel that they can't get out of a situation. Mm-hmm. Some people may feel very flooded with emotions because they don't have their usual agency or means of coping. And this kind of trauma also kind of brings on what we call hypervigilance, or sort of this alertness, an extra alertness to danger. We talk about fight, flight, or freeze, which is our body's way of reacting to keeping us to survive, right? So mm-hmm. With your extremities flood with blood, and you get ready to either move or fight, or sometimes freeze if it becomes overwhelming. And so you might notice someone feeling just completely paralyzed in a moment, with either anxiety and they can't move, or panic attacks, things like that. So, and a lot of irritability. And not to say that we don't all have that, but you might see extra in folks who have had past traumas.
Right. So to your point, people with a history of past trauma, they might be experiencing things in a magnified way, even more magnified than others in the home might be experiencing them. And that's already magnified. So, sure. Family members might notice, like somebody being, you said, more irritable, maybe having kind of roller coaster of emotions.
Exactly.
And what is an example of hypervigilance? What would that look like with people at home?
I would say, hypervigilance would be like, let's say, thinking that everything might be a threat, let's say, to contamination, for example, making sure that everything is always wiped down at all times. Certainly a lot of us are practicing, the guidelines, the good hygiene, wiping things down, but it may just be at an exacerbated level. They may be much more fearful about going outside, let's say, to get the mail, or because of this heightened, sense of there's danger out there, I don't want to go. And so It's kind of measuring the extent to which it's prudent, and then where it might sort of advance to be more outsized. And someone who has had more hypervigilance or being on guard might then, react in a bigger way.
And they might then also become more hypervigilant or try to gain control of other people in their environment as a way to try to stay safe?
Sure, absolutely. And part of that is wanting to keep their loved ones safe. And so they might be, say, well, I don't want you to do this, or I don't want you to do that because I'm afraid of something might happen to you. And of course, that's all coming out of love. And it also can create, as you know, in couples and families, it can create a little bit of tension if someone is saying, it's not that big of a deal, we're doing what we can. And then the other person is really having this fear or this extra watchfulness that others may not have.
And just knowing that, one, for the person who has gone through past trauma or family members of that person, can know that that might be what's going on, you know, a sense of roller coaster of emotions, hypervigilance, trying to gain control, not only of their past, but also of the present. So that can be really helpful just to know that.
Sure. And, you know, it's all going to be different in different places, because for some people, they might not have shared a past trauma with their family members. And then it's even more of a mystery as to why this person is feeling, let's say, trapped or something like that. And so part of that is hopefully creating a safe environment for that person, even if they don't feel like disclosing something, just being really cognizant and supportive of their reaction and validating of their reactions and just being there for them, even if you don't understand the details, of just being really understanding. And then hopefully then that will also help calm the nervous system a bit. And, you know, we talk a little bit about this idea of CoRegulation, which is essentially how do we manage to kind of calm our bodies down when we're feeling anxious, and when we're in families and in couples, if we attend to each other in ways where everybody's kind of trying to understand the other's experience and kind of say, hey, look, I'm there for you. It's okay. We're going to be safe. I'm here with you. Co-regulation means you're working together to kind of bring that anxiety down. And that can be really helpful when people do that together.
So co-regulation is kind of a clinical term that really for people out there, just to know that sort of like when you're in the presence of somebody who it could be soothing to you, you can almost borrow that soothing presence to kind of co-regulate your own emotional system.
Absolutely. There's some excellent research out there, and there's a good study that talks about the effect of someone doing an MRI and having, you know, being anxious. And when they're holding a stranger's hand, maybe some of the anxiety goes down, but when they're holding their loved one's hand, the anxiety really goes down, the heart rate goes down. And so the beauty of, and you know, as a certified EFT therapist, the beauty of being able to share that connection with each other, and it might just be putting a hand on someone's shoulder or giving them a hug within your pod, so to speak, that can really help biologically lower that heart rate and keep that person feeling much more calm.
Soothe the brain, soothe the nervous system.
Exactly.
Yeah, so powerful, right? So there's this saying that neurons that fire together, wire together, right? And there's kind of good news and not so good news about that, I think, because the neurons that fire together during a trauma wire together. You can't see my hands, wire together. and so that can kind of lead to the lasting effects of the trauma. But there's also good news that we can somehow learn and teach ourselves how to fire new neural or pathways in the brain that can forge new ways of coping with the pain inside or the trauma. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So what you're talking about, Jeff, is this idea called Hebb's axiom. And it was this theory kind of posited really in the last century about how when your brain's neurons have a particular focus or a situation that happens, the emotions, the thoughts, and the physical sensations all fire together to kind of create the picture, create the memory for that. It's a way to encode it. And in a trauma, what we kind of have learned is that, yes, the brain is associative. So if something happens, for example, like when I've worked with military people, if they were in Iraq and there was an explosion on the side of the highway, whatever your brain encoded around that, the street signs, the time of day, the temperature, then also might be reactivated if they see a bag on the street and the conditions are right. So that's where the brain associates all those things kind of together, like sort of a ripple effect. And so that's why we were just talking about triggers. right? So if something is feeling like I'm trapped, that might be a trigger from the past because your brain has wired that way. Like you said, the good news is that, especially, you know, the kind of trauma focused treatment that we do and just working on changing those associations, when people are no longer in danger and they can start to understand that that's the case and start to make new connections, then new neurons might fire together and wire together and no longer associated with that past trauma.
That's really a beautiful explanation of that. And maybe in the simplest way to think about it is, if you're walking through the woods many times in one direction, that's the path that's going to get cleared and formed. And then if you decide you're going to walk down a different path, that's a new path that's going to get cleared and formed, right? So we want to help people to go down this new path. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I think, to your point, Jeff, it's a great analogy, because if you imagine you're walking down the path and one time a grizzly bear came in your way and you're like, oh, danger, grizzly bear, then that every time you walk down a path, you think that's hypervigilance. Oh my gosh, I could run into a grizzly bear. So part of what we want to do with the brain, and part of what we do, what they call exposure therapy, is help the person imaginally and in real life start to walk down and imagine walking down these paths over and over and over again. And the more times that you go down the path and there's not a bear, the more times the brain is like, oh, okay, maybe this is okay. It's no longer associated with it.
That's great. Okay. So, you know, these episodes, we're just about at our time frame now. And we might have to do this in another episode perhaps, but I just wanted to make a quick comment that, you know, the kind of coping strategies that can help to soothe the brain of people who are very reactive or flooded with emotion, diaphragmatic breathing, muscle relaxation techniques, thought shifting. We don't have time today, unfortunately, to kind of dig into those, but anybody can Google these. Diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation is an excellent technique, and working on changing thought patterns, something called thought shifting. Lots of information will come up if they Google those, and maybe we can come back another time and dig into some of those coping strategies. So, Laura, thank you so much
for
your time and your presence and the gift of your information. And thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, and everybody hang in there.